the process of trying to do the people's will in the face of all of these choke points of power through which, the woke rule. It's a new institutional consensus.
This seems like a movement that flies away from evidence.
It has used the container of Science magazine, Nature magazine, to infiltrate all of this propaganda. In my view, to make a false thing true would mean that we no longer live in a liberal, pluralistic society where there is both a right to belief and a right to unbelief.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Wesley Yang, author of The Souls of Yellow Folk and the editor of the Year Zero Substack. Welcome, Wesley.
Hi, thanks.
Wesley, you've coined a really interesting phrase, the successor ideology, which, I don't know, if I was going to be broad, it sums up sort of wokeness, I guess you could say. Why did you pick those terms? What are the implications of it?
It didn't quite get off the launching pad, so I still refer to it as kind of my own private jargon. And, it seems that the world has converged upon wokeness to describe this phenomenon. But, some years back, before we had a real lexicon, it was clear there was a kind of, hyper-liberalism and various attempts to name this new this ideology in a new key that had emerged, and this was my attempt. It had happened sort of, it happened kind of fortuitously on Twitter, where I referred to it as a kind of successor ideology, which wanted to, capture the sense in which, a language that was being sold as a form of liberalism was a kind of succession beyond it, and a kind of a move where many of the, key terms of liberalism were being sort of subsumed and consumed from within in a kind of, regressive movement that purported to be progress. And so, we began thinking that in order to make any further gains in a world where we were defining oppression, sort of gender and race-based oppression as a kind of miasma that permeated of our Western inheritance. It called for, the redefinition of free speech as a pillar of white supremacy, and suggesting that the scientific method itself was something that was infected at its core by, cis heteropatriarchal norms. And, we didn't quite have a container term for it, and that's the successor ideology attempted to be. It remains my own private jargon, and there are some other people that use it. So
I think one thing I particularly like about it is it does sort of get across the sense of actually how widespread this phenomenon is, in a way that sometimes with the word woke, people are able to say, well, only a tiny proportion of people are really that woke. But actually what you're getting across is this really is what they believe, what like a substantial proportion of people in charge believe.
It's a new institutional consensus. And it took a while for people to understand it, but the more the messaging gets rolled out and becomes pervasive, I think the more people are starting to understand that this is not just a student-led phenomenon. This is not a fringe phenomenon. This has been widely adopted by not just universities and schools of education and culture industries, but we hear the same messaging from corporations as well. It is the default language for the legitimization of the status quo. It's the language through which institutional power throughout the Western world sort of derives its warrant for its authority.
Yeah, and you've described trans in particular as the apex of this, even more so perhaps than the sort of racial matters or gender matters.
Yeah, because it's the place where actual populations, right, become subsumed by an identity into which any disaffected person can identify themselves as. There's no definition of what it means to be a trans person other than says that they're a member of the opposite sex. And one is specifically sort of enjoined against saying that there's any other, determination for who belongs to this category of person other than self-identification.
Yeah.
And self-identification, of course, is written directly into law in in many states, and that is the end goal, to have any person who declares themselves to be a woman to be recognized and treated as a woman. And so that's a conceptual shift, because it poses the question of whether a person's counterfactual assertion about the self can impose an obligation on others, a duty of recognition onto others that the state can affirm and enforce.
Yeah.
And that's what's being determined in these various legal, political disputes in every state throughout the Western world. With some pushback in the United States at the moment. But there's a different state of play in different states, and of course in the United Kingdom right now, there is a movement where the Supreme Court found that the term sex in its equality legislation, in fact, was referring to biological sex.
Yeah.
And an effort was recently made by the Biden administration to overwrite sex with gender identity in the law that protects the rights of women within universities. And the same legislation has repeatedly been attempted. It's called the Equality Act, by virtually every member of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives several times. And of course, this legislation would mean that in the place of schools under Title IX, it would mean that every school in the country, from K through kindergarten through university, would have to provide access to any boy or man who declares himself to be a woman to the women's private spaces, and to provide them with a right against discrimination to be referred to by their preferred pronouns. And the Equality Act would extend this anti-discrimination measure to every public accommodation in America. Now, the Title IX law was struck down by a judge who found it to be in violation of Title IX and in violation of the United States Constitution, right before the Biden administration left. And there is good reason to suspect that they would do the same with an Equality Act that the Democrats have repeatedly attempted to push through Congress, were it to pass. But nonetheless, self-identification, as the determinant of who and what is a woman, remains the horizon of possibility that the transgender movement seeks. And in seeking that, it's crossing, an important inflection point, an important threshold that would really change the nature of what it means to have a right. Because it wouldn't just be sort of a right to believe what you want to believe. It would be a right to compel others to believe or to acquiesce in their behavior what the individual wants to believe. So it's a kind of warrant for the subordination of all to each. And so that's a kind of jumping off point, the end of the age of emancipation. Because either this project of sort of making it a right for others to accept my counterfactual assertions about my identity, right, as fact, and to treat it as such, and in my view, to make a false thing true, would mean that we no longer live in a liberal, pluralistic society where there is both a religious belief, a right to belief, and a right to unbelief. It would become a society in which one person's counterfactual assertions about the self would impose a duty upon others, right, of acquiescence. And this is very different than the various forms of, sacralization of identities that entail actual populations that can be sort of distinguished and determined by some, external characteristic. Because those other populations, like Black Americans, for example, are real populations with real needs and real interests that are not defined by an apparatus that purports to speak on their behalf. So even at the height of the George Floyd protests, polling of Black Americans said that most of them, a robust supermajority of them, wanted as much policing or more policing than the status quo was providing them.
Yeah.
So there was this apparatus that controlled the media and the various institutions that said that the horizon of the future will be the defunding of the police and the abolition of the prison system, but ran up against the actual needs of an actual population that in the end turned out to be a question of municipal budget allocations, right? And it just turned out to be untenable when the various efforts, formal and informal, to either defund or culturally and morally delegitimize the act of policing and the provision of public safety, right, to marginalized communities who are owed this public good, right, could not, withstand the test of reality. Whereas a transgender population is one whose the very conditions of their existence as a distinct population are, in fact, created by, this kind of apparatus of social change that any person can identify into. And that population thus doesn't have a set of interests distinct from what that apparatus says, right? And what that apparatus says is that we're going to cross a threshold about what it means to have a right, and so one of two things happens with this attempt to make a false thing true, which is either they succeed at their attempt, and they bring to a conclusion the liberal, pluralistic society that has been that has always been the kind of precondition for the pursuit of the project of emancipation, and thus they bring the end of the project of emancipation to a close in that way, or they fail in their attempt to do that, and they demonstrate by their example that there is in fact no one left to emancipate in the traditional sense of emancipation, right? Having gone through, race, gender, reach this kind of reductio ad absurdum of the emancipatory project, where we are redefining objective reality, biological reality, as itself a form of oppression that must be overcome. Like, we're going to run up against that threshold, and we're either going to cross it and undercut the very terms through which we can speak of emancipation, or that will be the Waterloo of this emancipatory project until such a time as we're able to design embryos in a womb, right? Or technological change, of course, will open new horizons for that Promethean emancipatory push. But to the extent that we, don't push ourselves up against that technological horizon, we've kind of reached the end. Like the terminal boredom at the end of history, generated this tremendous nostalgia for, there's a demand side need for there to be, a great moral crusade, to which we could take part, which is, of course, a big part of the appeal of transgenderism. We're going to take troubled, quirky teenagers. We're going to tell them that they are oppressed by living in a cis heteropatriarchal society. We're going to generate a kind of massive Potemkin village utopia in which chemically castrating themselves, dosing themselves with hormones, cutting off healthy body parts, is what helps them be their true, authentic selves. And anyone who stands in the way of doing this to children is a hated oppressor. This is a kind of demand-side generation of a conflict for those who have a nostalgia for the great emancipatory projects of the past.
And one other thing that maybe also characterized those past moves for emancipation was the use of reason, the use of evidence. It's the fact of human equal worth is surely something that can be you can be reasoned into. But this seems like a movement that flies away from evidence, particularly scientific evidence, when it comes to.
Well, what it's done is it's captured, right, the truth, knowledge seeking and certifying institutions, and it has imposed the reign of dogma onto them. But it has sort of used the container of Science magazine, Nature magazine, to infiltrate all of this propaganda that takes on the form of science, with the content hollowed out. And of course, when you actually look at the pseudo-silence that was used to justify and propagate pediatric gender medicine, as it is called, there was never any evidence. Sort of the National Health Services of Sweden and Finland and Norway, and of course here in the UK, which did, with the Cass Review, the most exhaustive review of the evidence. Was any of this high-quality evidence that met the normative standards of truth-seeking and truth certification? And the answer is, of course, no. These were corrupted advocacy studies. Through and through, right from the beginning, that didn't meet those standards, but that control the commanding heights of those institutions making those claims. But eventually, these other institutions that have a role, in particular in social democratic societies, that because they have a universal health system and they have centralized systems that study, because it's important for them, when you have a universal health system, it's important for them to know whether things are real.
Yeah.
And as a result, there was enough integrity left in those systems, in the National Health Services of Sweden, Norway, Finland, and the UK, for them to do a real inquiry and to discover what critics of the field have known for a long time, and to issue official pronouncements that no, of course, there has never been any evidence that any of this makes any sense. And of course, it aligns with people's general intuitions that using an off-label cancer drug used to treat prostate cancer to stunt the crucial developmental phase of sort of emotional, physical, and cognitive development of young people, namely puberty, right, in order to create boys who look more convincingly like girls, is going to be a healthy process. Any person should be able to see that and say, this is totally aberrant. It's insane that we ever attempted it. And further study along these lines will, as a matter of certainty, never generate evidence so long as it is done in a way that has any integrity. Not that it can ever be done with integrity, but so long as the results are interpreted with any integrity, that is going to vindicate it.
Yeah.
And yet we still have nearly every medical association in the United States still swearing by the claim that these procedures are life-saving, medically necessary, and scientifically proven. None of those things are true, and it's very difficult to accept that for those who, were raised trusting in our truth-certifying and truth-seeking institutions. And that's what's so frightening about this cause, because it demonstrates that it doesn't take gulags, and it doesn't take state coercion to produce this kind of Lysenkoist corruption of medicine. Yeah. It simply takes some relatively minor, and of course scaling up to more, to less minor rewards and punishments, within the matrix of bourgeois conformity, in order to produce outcomes that took vastly more state repression in order to generate in East Germany.
I wanted to ask you about race. You've written a lot about the Asian American experience, and that seems to also blow up the contention that this has anything to do with equality or genuine equality and equal treatment.
Yeah, well, we've learned so much over the last few years about affirmative action. If you looked at the data, you saw that the group that lost out most from affirmative action ended up being Asian Americans, right? There was a study back in 2006 that found that 4 out of 5 slots that were reserved for what came to be referred to as, sort of URMs, right? Like underrepresented minorities, in contrast to Asian Americans, who were an overrepresented minority relative to the scale of their population, but perhaps not relative to the scale of their achievement, right? Of their academic achievement. In fact, not overrepresented relative to that, just as these other groups were not underrepresented relative to achievement. And so, studies that were done back in 2009, and they were only further, that have only been further kind of amplified or confirmed by subsequent investigation, including within the lawsuit that resulted in the declaration that race preferential policies in the United States violated both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. They all found that, if you simply went by academic achievement, test scores, and grades, blacks would make about 2% of Harvard's graduating class, and they in fact represented 9%. And this was back in 2006. It only became more that way with the passage of time. So what happened was, affirmative action, which of course at its outset was always understood to be a short-term expedient and not supposed to be a permanent condition, eventually outlived the political and also the cultural and administrative reasons for its existence. Yeah. It happened all very rapidly, in part because the country became much more diverse. And so it ceased to be simply a kind of warrant to give a leg up to a group that had been historically marginalized and genuinely oppressed, right, to a kind of spoils system for an increasingly multicultural society, where you had groups of people that were arriving here having not experienced any historical marginalization, becoming eligible for affirmative action on the basis of diversity from day one, right? And then, of course, it was necessary amidst all of this to exact that from the Asian American group that was overrepresented, right? And so all of this sort of violates people's general sense of fairness and of justice. And it turned out to be the case that nobody supported it. Of course, nobody has supported it for a long time. It's always been opposed in polling, since the 1970s, by 2-to-1 of the public, right? And yet, so we have an example here of a policy that remained in place in the face of a decades-long supermajority opposition to it. Yeah. Right? So back in 2003, there was a book that came out by a guy called Hugh Davis Graham that predicted in 2003 that the confluence of affirmative action and mass immigration would generate a populist revolt that would result in the end of both policies, right? And a very prescient policy. And we've seen the blowing up of both of those things. And what we saw was the blowing up of the support of affirmative action and the blowing up of the support for mass immigration. And, just very recently, Rasmussen, the pollster, and of course, they're seen as a kind of partisan pollster. But nonetheless, their polling of approval ratings for Trump thus far found that the group that most approves of Trump's performance thus far is Hispanic Americans, right? 63% of them. Yeah. So that's 9 points more than white Americans. Okay, and so why do Hispanic Americans support Trump more than anyone else, particularly as the salience of mass deportation, right, rises to the surface? Yeah. And the answer is that it's no longer a narrative violation to say that Hispanics support deportation. It's actually what they support, and it's not that hard to figure out why they might, right? Because the person that is working a low-wage job, does he support a further influx of other people competing with him for a low-wage job? The answer is maybe not, right? Or the person that went through an arduous process in order to attain legal immigration, does he support an opening of a border, allowing people to come here with impunity while flouting laws that they obeyed? Maybe they don't. If you came here fleeing dangerous gangs, are you glad to see a cohort in which the dangerous gangs are hidden? Do you welcome that? I don't think you necessarily do. So it turns out that newcomers to the country are the ones who are most exposed to further newcomers to the country, and that we passed a certain threshold, right? Immigration is all about the rate of ingress. People's toleration toward immigration is all about a rate of ingress. Something that is good in moderation ceases to be good when it is done to excess. And the people get to decide. And in 2024, before the election, a supermajority of respondents to pollsters said they supported the deportation of every illegal immigrant in the country. Now, how do you arrive at that sentiment? Because sentiment was not like this at all in 2018 under the prior Trump administration. Sentiment changed because Joe Biden allowed in something like 10 to 20 million illegal immigrants into this country. So the combination of legal and illegal immigration brought in more people in a shorter period of time, more people in a 4-year span of time than had ever before arrived in America and American history. Wow. And so you can't do that without spreading the widespread perception among people of every race that we have moved from this being done in moderation that is tolerable to them to it being done in excess that calls for effectual action in the face. And the group that is, to stop this, and the group that is leading this, above all, is Hispanics in this sentiment. So what all this means is that we had various policies like mass immigration and affirmative action that were for decades kept off the agenda of things that the political class felt it to be kosher to represent. But in both cases, it was judged to be totally legitimate because of a confluence of sort of libertarian economic dogma, alongside a kind of leftist progressive moralizing that made these policies impregnable. And it was a very effective way of doing politics, but it generated backlash, as these things will tend to do. And it has now generated a new politics, because in 2023, the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, said it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And it turns out that a small majority of Black people support the decision, and larger majorities of every other group support that decision. And so what it means is that the enormous push beginning around 2013, 2014 to both prop up and consolidate the affirmative action regime, but also vastly expand it into new realms, over the course of 3 elections, was adjudicated by the democratic process. And the outcome of that adjudication of that democratic process is that the people have repudiated that attempt to the extent that the public is able to say no to these things. The public said no. And the public said no, of course, because Trump's victory, was based upon an influx of minority voters rallying to the side of Trump. Now, in fact, even in his first election, Trump won because he improved on the margins with minority voters, with Hispanics, and above all. But in 2024, he won by very nearly taking a majority of Hispanics. And perhaps that will mean, the end of this belief, that a coalition of, sort of white educated elites and minorities will exercise a hegemonic politics that continue to keep the politics of mass immigration, the politics of affirmative action off the agenda forever. We've been through it, and we've defeated it. And of course, this doesn't change the fact that the institutional consensus remains what it was. It's just that the institutional consensus has lost its ability to limit the boundaries through which electoral politics happens. And what's going to happen over the next few years is that we're going to determine the extent to which electoral politics can prevail in the face of a cultural, institutional, administrative, and juridical consensus. And there's no clear answers. And the process of trying to do the people's will, right, in the face of all of these choke points of power through which, the woke rule, through which the successor ideology is instantiated, right? It's going to get ugly. It's already been a little bit ugly. It's going to get uglier. And we're going to see the extent to which it gets uglier, and we're going to see the extent to which the will of the people can, in fact, be made to prevail through the existing architecture of rule, given the fact that there remains, right, this powerful institutional consensus that is every bit as woke as it was today as it was, before the election.
Wesley Yang, thank you very much.
Yeah.